The prayer wheel's rhythm. Sarah's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before her alarm. She'd been awake for 20 minutes already, her mind cycling through the presentation she'd deliver in 4 hours, the emails that had accumulated overnight, and the familiar weight pressing against her chest, a heaviness that seemed to grow each morning despite 8 hours in bed. The bathroom mirror reflected back a woman who looked older than her 38 years. Her skin held a greyish pallor that no amount of expensive serums could brighten. Dark circles pooled beneath eyes that felt perpetually tired, as if she were viewing the world through thick glass. She touched her face gently, remembering when her reflection didn't require this daily negotiation with disappointment. In the kitchen, she measured coffee grounds with the precision of someone who'd tried every wellness trend available. Keto, intermittent fasting, HIIT workouts at 6 a.m., supplements that promised cellular energy, meditation apps that guided her breathing while her mind raced ahead to deadlines. Each approach had lasted weeks or months before dissolving into the chaos of her consulting schedule. Her phone lit up with notifications, a client revision request, a calendar reminder for her annual physical next week, and a documentary suggestion from Netflix about longevity in high-altitude regions. The thumbnail showed an elderly man holding what looked like a prayer wheel, his face serene despite deep lines that spoke of decades in harsh mountain winds. "Another miracle cure documentary," she muttered. But something in the man's expression made her pause. He looked genuinely at peace, not performing wellness for social media or selling anything, just present. The documentary began as she prepared her usual breakfast smoothie, protein powder, spinach, berries, and supplements that promised everything her body apparently lacked. The narrator's voice filled her kitchen as images of Tibet unfolded. Monasteries perched impossibly high, prayer wheels spinning in weathered hands, and people who seemed to carry an internal stillness that no amount of meditation apps had given her. In the thin air of Lhasa, the narrator explained, researchers have documented extraordinary longevity and vitality among Tibetan populations, despite living at altitudes where oxygen is scarce and life is harsh. Their secret isn't found in any supplement bottle or fitness regimen, but in daily practices so subtle they're nearly invisible to outsiders. Sarah found herself setting down her phone, actually listening instead of multitasking. The documentary showed morning rituals performed in complete darkness, breathing sequences that activated what neuroscientists called the most powerful circadian reset available to humans. Unlike her meditation app's guided instructions that often left her mind more cluttered, these practices worked through profound silence. Her laptop chimed with another email. The familiar tightness gripped her shoulders, a tension so constant she only noticed it when it intensified. On screen, an elderly Tibetan woman prepared tea with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed, each gesture flowing into the next, without hurry. "I don't have time for that level of slowness," Sarah thought, then caught herself. When had speed become her default response to everything? Even her breathing felt rushed. The documentary described how Tibetan morning routines began before sunrise, in complete darkness, allowing the nervous system to transition naturally rather than being jolted awake by alarms and blue light. Sarah glanced at her phone, which she typically checked within minutes of waking, flooding her system with cortisol before she'd even stood up. As she gathered her laptop bag and travel mug, the narrator mentioned something about prayer wheels, not as religious objects, but as tools for cultivating what they called moving meditation. The circular motion apparently synchronized breathing and heart rate, creating states of coherence that Western medicine was just beginning to understand. Sarah paused at her door, remembering her grandmother's small collection of artifacts from her travels through Asia decades ago. Somewhere in her storage unit sat items her grandmother had treasured, including a small prayer wheel that had fascinated Sarah as a child. She'd forgotten about it entirely until this moment. The morning commute blurred past as usual. Crowded subway cars, the persistent buzz of fluorescent office lighting, and coffee that never quite delivered the energy it promised. But something had shifted. Instead of immediately diving into emails, she found herself wondering about those Tibetan breathing sequences, performed in darkness while her own mornings began with the harsh glare of screens. Her friend Marcus stopped by her cubicle mid-morning, noting her distraction. "You look like you're solving world peace over there. What's up?" "Just watched something interesting about Tibetan health practices. Apparently they have incredible longevity at high altitudes." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Please tell me you're not about to move to a mountaintop. I've seen your attempts at camping." Sarah laughed, but privately wondered what it would feel like to wake up without immediately checking email, to move through morning routines with the kind of deliberate peace she'd witnessed on screen. That afternoon, her energy crashed as predictably as always. The familiar combination of mental fog and physical heaviness settled in, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. She found herself thinking about prayer wheels, their circular motion, the way they seemed to anchor the elderly man's attention to something beyond his racing thoughts. Maybe there was something to explore there, something that didn't require moving to Tibet or abandoning her career, but might address whatever was making her feel chronically depleted, despite doing everything right, according to every wellness expert she'd followed. If you've ever felt tired even after a full night of sleep, or frustrated with diets that don't last, tell us in the comments which part of this story feels familiar. And stay with us for the next chapters. Sarah spent her lunch break researching instead of scrolling social media, diving deeper into what the documentary had only touched on. The science behind Tibetan health practices revealed patterns that made her conventional wellness routine seem almost chaotic by comparison. Unlike the complex protocols she'd tried, tracking macros, measuring ketones, monitoring heart rate variability, Tibetan habits operated on elegant simplicity. Cold exposure wasn't ice baths or cryotherapy chambers, but deliberate breathing of frigid mountain air for specific intervals. Movement wasn't high-intensity interval training, but altitude-adapted flows that worked with oxygen scarcity rather than fighting it. The research on brown fat activation and mitochondrial biogenesis fascinated her, while she'd been forcing her body through intense workouts that left her depleted. Tibetans triggered similar cellular benefits through practices that actually restored energy. The contradiction felt profound. Her culture's approach to health often involved suffering, while theirs seemed to cultivate ease. That weekend, Sarah drove to the storage unit she'd avoided for months. Among her grandmother's belongings, wrapped in faded tissue paper, she found it. A small brass prayer wheel, its surface darkened with age and wear. The weight felt substantial in her palm, and when she gave it a tentative spin, the motion was surprisingly smooth and quiet. Her grandmother's journal, tucked beneath the prayer wheel, contained entries from a trip to Tibet in the 1970s. Sarah had never read it before, always meaning to but never finding time. Now sitting on her storage unit's concrete floor, she opened to a random page. Woke again before the alarm, but differently than at home. Here consciousness arrives gently, like water slowly filling a bowl. Tenzin showed me how they begin each day, not by grabbing time, but by letting it gather around them. The prayer wheel helps. Its rhythm slows my breathing without effort, the way a metronome might settle a scattered orchestra. Sarah felt a strange recognition reading those words. Her own mornings felt like grabbing time, snatching moments between obligations rather than allowing the day to unfold. Back home, she placed the prayer wheel on her nightstand. That evening, instead of checking her phone before bed, she held it in her hands, letting it spin slowly while she breathed. The motion was hypnotic, not in a drowsy way, but focusing. Her racing thoughts seemed to settle into the rhythm, her shoulders dropping unconsciously. She'd read about the importance of transitioning to sleep without screens, but had never found a replacement activity that felt purposeful rather than boring. The prayer wheel gave her something to do with her hands, something that engaged her attention while gradually calming her nervous system. The first few nights she felt self-conscious, worried she was appropriating something sacred or playing at spirituality. But her grandmother's journal helped frame it differently, as a tool for cultivating presence, the way some people used breathing exercises or progressive muscle relaxation. Monday morning brought the first surprise. She woke 3 minutes before her alarm, but instead of the usual anxiety-driven alertness, consciousness arrived gradually. Her sleep app showed the same 7 hours, but something qualitatively different had happened. The grogginess that typically lingered until her second cup of coffee was simply absent. "You seem different," her colleague Elena observed during their morning stand-up meeting. "More alert. Did you change your coffee?" Sarah hesitated, uncertain how to explain that she'd been spinning a prayer wheel before bed. "Just experimenting with a better sleep routine," she said, which was true if incomplete. But Eleanor's comment stayed with her. Other people were noticing something she was just beginning to feel, a subtle shift in her energy quality that had nothing to do with caffeine or stimulation. That week, she began researching Tibetan breakfast practices. Instead of the protein smoothies that left her hungry 2 hours later, she tried their approach to warm, simple foods: bone broth with barley instead of cold smoothies, hot water with ginger instead of iced beverages. Foods that, according to traditional Tibetan medicine, supported her digestive fire rather than dampening it. The changes felt almost embarrassingly simple. No special supplements, no complex timing protocols, just warmer foods and hot liquids throughout the day. Yet her energy remained steadier, without the familiar afternoon crashes that sent her reaching for sugar or caffeine. Marcus joined her for lunch on Thursday, watching her sip hot soup while he ate a cold salad. "Since when do you eat hot food in summer?" he asked. "Aren't you burning up?" "It's a Tibetan thing, supposedly better for digestion and energy." "Tibetan thing?" "Sarah, you live in Chicago. Your biggest altitude challenge is climbing to your 4th-floor apartment." She laughed, but privately noted how much more comfortable she felt after warm meals compared to the cold food she'd been eating for years, in pursuit of some undefined health goal. The prayer wheel had become a natural part of her evening routine, not a forced meditation practice that felt like another task to accomplish, but a transition ritual that helped her nervous system recognize the end of the day. Sometimes she'd spin it for 2 minutes, sometimes 10, letting her body dictate the duration rather than following rigid protocols. Sleep was arriving more naturally, without the tossing and restlessness that had become her norm. She'd stopped checking her phone after 9 p.m., using the prayer wheel as a replacement activity that satisfied her need for mental engagement while gradually shifting toward rest. But the most intriguing change was something she couldn't quite name, a quality of presence that felt different from her usual state of focused productivity. Less effortful, more sustainable. As if she was learning to work with her nervous system rather than constantly overriding it. 3 weeks into her new routine, Sarah's morning alarm went off to find her already awake, sitting quietly with the prayer wheel in her hands. Not anxiously alert as before, but peacefully present. A state she couldn't remember experiencing since childhood. The shift felt so subtle she might have dismissed it, except others kept commenting. Her hairstylist mentioned how much healthier her skin looked. Her mother, during their weekly call, said she sounded less frantic. Even her building's doorman asked if she'd been on vacation, noting how relaxed she seemed. "I haven't been on vacation in 8 months, Sarah told Elena over coffee, "but I have been sleeping better." "What changed?" "You've tried everything. Those expensive sleep trackers, blackout curtains, that white noise machine that sounded like a helicopter." Sarah hesitated. How could she explain that a small brass wheel had accomplished more than thousands of dollars in sleep optimization technology? "I've been doing some Tibetan relaxation practices before bed. Very simple stuff." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Tibetan? Like meditation? Sort of, more about transitioning away from the day's energy instead of just passing out from exhaustion. The conversation stayed with her as she walked back to the office. For years, she'd approached sleep like everything else, as a problem to solve through discipline and technology. The prayer wheel had introduced her to a different approach, creating space for natural transitions rather than forcing them. That afternoon brought an unexpected test. A client emergency required her to work until nearly 10 p.m., exactly the kind of situation that would normally derail her sleep routine entirely. Previously, she'd have gone straight from urgent emails to bed, her nervous system still humming with stress hormones. Instead, she spent 10 minutes with the prayer wheel, letting its steady rhythm gradually down-regulate her system. The spinning motion seemed to pull her attention away from the day's problems, creating distance between work stress and sleep preparation. She woke the next morning feeling notably more rested than usual after late work sessions. The prayer wheel hadn't eliminated stress, but it had provided a bridge between activation and rest, something she'd never known her nervous system needed. Marcus visited her apartment that weekend, noting the small changes she'd made. "Where's your coffee table mountain of magazines and supplements?" he asked, gesturing to her notably cleaner living space. "I put most of them away. Turns out I don't actually read them, just collect them like security blankets." He picked up the prayer wheel from her nightstand, turning it over curiously. "This is new, very monk-like. You're not about to shave your head and move to a monastery, are you? It helps me sleep, simple as that." "But it's just spinning metal. How does that do anything?" Sarah considered how to explain it. "You know how some people need white noise or complete silence? This gives my mind something to focus on that gradually slows down my thinking, like a mental gear shift." Marcus spun the wheel experimentally, then set it down with a shrug. "If it works for you, though I still think you just needed better sleep hygiene all along." His dismissiveness stung slightly, but Sarah recognized the voice of her former self. Always looking for complex solutions to simple problems, skeptical of anything that seemed too easy or too old-fashioned. That week, she began exploring Tibetan approaches to cold exposure. Instead of her usual hot shower routine, she ended with 30 seconds of cold water while practicing slow, deliberate breathing. The initial shock was intense, but following it with deep, steady breathing created an unexpected sense of invigoration rather than stress. The cold exposure research fascinated her. Unlike ice baths or cryotherapy, which delivered cold as punishment, Tibetan practices used cold as training for the nervous system's resilience. Brief, voluntary exposure followed by conscious breathing that activated brown fat and improved circulation. Within a few days, she noticed improved energy throughout the day, and her hands and feet, chronically cold since college, began staying warmer. The cold showers also seemed to improve her mood, creating what researchers called stress inoculation, small, manageable challenges that increased her capacity to handle larger stressors. Her annual physical appointment arrived with unexpected results. Dr. Rodriguez reviewed her blood work with visible surprise. "Your inflammatory markers are notably improved from last year. Are you taking any new supplements?" "No new supplements. I've been sleeping better and doing some simple stress management practices." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. Your cortisol levels are in a much healthier range, and your vitamin D has improved significantly." Walking home from the appointment, Sarah felt quietly amazed. She'd spent years trying to optimize her health through complicated protocols and expensive interventions. Yet simple practices, better sleep transitions, cold exposure, warm foods, had created measurable improvements in her blood work. That evening, Elena called with an unusual request. "I know this might sound strange, but could you show me that Tibetan sleep thing you mentioned? I've been having the worst insomnia, and you seem so much calmer lately." Sarah agreed to demonstrate the prayer wheel practice, feeling slightly embarrassed about sharing something so simple. But Eleanor's genuine interest reminded her how desperate she'd once felt for anything that might improve her sleep quality. As she showed Elena the gentle spinning motion and corresponding breath pattern, Sarah realized how naturally the practice had integrated into her life. What had initially felt foreign and self-conscious now seemed as essential as brushing her teeth, a daily ritual that marked the transition from day to night. The prayer wheel sat quietly on her nightstand, holding space for whatever each evening might bring. Some nights she used it for 2 minutes, others for 15, always following her body's cues rather than rigid timing. It had become less about the object itself and more about the pause it created, a moment of stillness that allowed her nervous system to shift gears naturally. Would you rather force yourself with willpower or redesign your environment and habits like this character is learning to do? Comment which path makes more sense to you, and share this episode with someone who needs a gentler approach to change. 2 months later, Sarah faced her biggest test yet. A major client requested an accelerated project timeline that would require 12-hour days for 3 weeks straight, exactly the kind of deadline pressure that had always demolished her health routines. Previously, she would have abandoned all self-care practices, surviving on caffeine and takeout, while promising herself she'd get back on track after the project ended. This time felt different. The prayer wheel had taught her something about transitions and sustainability that made the all-or-nothing approach seem unnecessarily destructive. She decided to maintain modified versions of her Tibetan practices even during the most intense work periods. Hot soup for lunch instead of skipped meals, 5 minutes with the prayer wheel before bed instead of 15, cold shower endings even when she barely had time for regular showers. The difference was remarkable. Instead of the usual cycle of burnout and recovery, she maintained steady energy throughout the demanding period. Her sleep remained restorative despite fewer hours. Her digestion stayed stable despite irregular mealtimes. Marcus watched her navigate the deadline crunch with visible bewilderment. "How are you not a complete disaster right now?" he asked during a brief lunch break. "I'm surviving on energy drinks and spite, but you look functional." "And more habits," Sarah said, stirring her hot soup slowly. "I used to think stress meant abandoning everything healthy. Now I just scale things down instead of eliminating them entirely." "That's it? Soup and your spinning thing?" "It's about nervous system maintenance, like changing your car's oil even during busy periods, instead of waiting until the engine seizes up." Marcus shook his head. "You've gotten very zen lately." "It's slightly disturbing." But Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the familiar combination of anxiety and depletion she remembered so well. She'd once worn that same expression daily, accepting it as the inevitable cost of professional success. The project wrapped successfully, but instead of the usual post-deadline collapse, Sarah felt tired but stable. Her energy returned within days rather than weeks. More importantly, she'd learned that her new practices weren't fragile routines that required perfect conditions. They were adaptable tools that actually became more valuable during challenging periods. That weekend, she visited Elena, who'd been experimenting with the prayer wheel practice for a month. "It's working," Elena said, holding the small wheel she'd ordered online. "I'm not sure how, but I'm falling asleep faster and waking up less anxious." "Any pushback from your family?" Sarah asked. Elena lived with her partner and teenage daughter, both naturally skeptical of anything that seemed weird. "David thinks I'm going through some midlife spiritual phase, but he admits I'm less cranky in the mornings. And Maya started asking about it because she's been having stress insomnia from college applications." They sat together in Elena's living room, each holding their prayer wheels, spinning them slowly while watching the sunset through her windows. The practice had evolved beyond bedtime routine into something more flexible, a tool for transitioning between different energy states throughout the day. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Called to check in, but you didn't sound stressed for once. Whatever you're doing differently, it suits you. These comments from others felt more validating than any sleep-tracking data or wellness metric. People in her life were noticing a change in her overall presence, less rushed, more grounded, as if she'd found some internal anchor that kept her steady during normal life turbulence. Dr. Rodriguez had mentioned that her cortisol levels suggested better stress management, but Sarah was beginning to understand that the real change wasn't about eliminating stress. It was about developing practices that helped her nervous system process and release stress rather than accumulating it indefinitely. The prayer wheel had become a symbol of this shift. Its circular motion reminded her that health wasn't a destination to reach through willpower and discipline, but a rhythm to cultivate through small, consistent practices that worked with her biology rather than against it. She'd started incorporating other Tibetan principles, eating until she was 80% full rather than completely satisfied, taking brief walking breaks during long work sessions, and drinking hot water throughout the day to support what Tibetan medicine called her digestive fire. None of these changes felt dramatic individually, but their cumulative effect was undeniable. She had more sustained energy, better sleep quality, improved digestion, and most surprisingly, a sense of ease she couldn't remember experiencing as an adult. Her grandmother's journal had become bedtime reading, filled with observations about Tibetan approaches to health and longevity. One passage particularly resonated. They seem to understand something we've forgotten, that the body has its own wisdom about healing and maintenance. Their practices simply create space for that wisdom to operate, rather than trying to force outcomes through complicated interventions. Sarah closed the journal and reached for her prayer wheel, beginning her evening transition ritual. The brass felt warm from her hands, its familiar weight and smooth spinning motion instantly shifting her nervous system toward rest. Outside her apartment, the city continued its relentless pace. Sirens, traffic, the blue glow of screens in neighboring windows. But inside, she'd created a small pocket of Tibetan-inspired calm that honored different rhythms, different relationships with time and energy. The prayer wheel spun quietly in her hands, its gentle motion gradually synchronizing her breathing and heart rate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she would rest in the way her body was designed to rest, not collapsing from exhaustion, but transitioning peacefully from one state to another. 6 months after finding her grandmother's prayer wheel, Sarah sat in Dr. Rodriguez's office reviewing her latest blood work. The changes were undeniable. Inflammatory markers had dropped to optimal ranges, her cortisol rhythm had normalized, and vitamin D levels suggested her brief morning sun exposure was working effectively. "These improvements are quite remarkable," Dr. Rodriguez said, scrolling through her results. "Usually I see this kind of positive change after major lifestyle overhauls, dramatic diet changes, intensive exercise programs. What exactly have you been doing?" Sarah considered how to explain. "Simple daily practices, mostly inspired by Tibetan health traditions, better sleep transitions, brief cold exposure, warm foods, some mindful breathing, Tibetan traditions." Dr. Rodriguez looked intrigued rather than skeptical. "I've been reading research about high-altitude populations and their remarkable health outcomes. Their practices are gaining serious attention in longevity medicine." The conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's understanding of what she'd experienced. This wasn't about adopting exotic practices from a distant culture. It was about rediscovering principles that supported human health before modern life complicated everything. That evening, she called her mother to share the good news about her blood work. "I'm so proud of you for finding something that works," her mother said. "You sound like yourself again, if that makes sense. More like you did before you got caught up in all that wellness anxiety." Wellness anxiety. The phrase perfectly captured what Sarah had been experiencing for years. The constant worry that she wasn't doing enough, tracking enough, optimizing enough to prevent some future health catastrophe. The prayer wheel had introduced her to a different relationship with self-care, trusting her body's signals rather than constantly trying to manage them. Marcus stopped by her apartment that weekend, ostensibly to borrow a book, but actually to understand what had changed about her. "You know what's weird?" he said, watching her prepare tea with the same deliberate movements she'd observed in that original documentary. "You seem healthier, but you're doing less stuff, not more. Where are all your supplements? Your workout schedules?" I realized I was treating my body like a broken machine that needed constant fixing, Sarah said, pouring hot water over ginger root. These Tibetan practices assume the body knows how to heal and maintain itself if you create the right conditions. But that's too simple. Health is supposed to be complicated, require sacrifice and discipline. Says who? Sarah handed him a cup of tea. People in Tibet maintain extraordinary health into advanced age through practices so basic they're almost invisible. Maybe we've overcomplicated everything. Marcus sipped the tea skeptically, but she noticed him relaxing despite himself. The warm liquid and slower pace of conversation created a different energy than his usual rapid-fire visits. As summer turned to fall, Sarah faced an unexpected challenge. Her company offered her a promotion that would require relocating to New York and returning to the intense schedule she'd finally learned to manage sustainably. The old Sarah would have automatically said yes, then figured out how to survive the increased stress later. Now she found herself considering different questions. Could she maintain her health practices in a more demanding role? Was career advancement worth sacrificing the stability she'd worked so hard to create? She spent several evenings with her prayer wheel, not seeking answers, but allowing the questions to settle into clarity. The spinning motion had become a form of decision-making support, not magical thinking, but a way to access her deeper wisdom beyond immediate emotional reactions. Elena visited during this decision-making period, bringing her own prayer wheel and joining Sarah for their occasional evening practice. "What does your gut tell you about New York?" Elena asked as they spun their wheels in comfortable silence. "That I don't want to go back to who I was before," Sarah said quietly. "The promotion feels like an invitation to resurrect my old relationship with work and stress. But maybe you're strong enough now to handle more demands without losing yourself." "No, or maybe wisdom is knowing when enough is enough." The conversation continued over the following days in Sarah's mind. She'd learned to trust the subtle signals her body provided about stress levels, energy reserves, and emotional sustainability. The Tibetan practices had taught her to recognize the difference between healthy challenge and depletion. A week later, she declined the promotion, choosing instead to negotiate for increased responsibilities in her current role without the relocation and lifestyle disruption. Her manager was surprised but supportive, noting that her work quality and creativity had noticeably improved over recent months. The decision felt right in her body, an alignment between her choices and her nervous system that she'd never experienced before. The prayer wheel had become more than a sleep aid. It was a tool for accessing the wisdom that emerged when her mind stopped racing long enough to listen. That night, she opened her grandmother's journal to a passage she'd read many times, but understood differently now. The prayer wheel teaches patience with mystery. Its rotation suggests that some truths can't be grasped directly, but must be approached through rhythm, repetition, and trust in processes larger than our immediate understanding. Perhaps this is what healing really is, learning to move in harmony with forces we can feel but can't fully control. Sarah held the small brass wheel, feeling its familiar weight and warmth. What had begun as curiosity about Tibetan longevity had become a complete reframing of her relationship with health, work, and life itself. The practices hadn't changed her external circumstances dramatically, but they'd transformed her capacity to navigate those circumstances with grace rather than constant emergency. The most profound realization was this: she'd stopped trying to force outcomes and started creating conditions for well-being to emerge naturally. The prayer wheel's circular motion had become a metaphor for this approach: steady, sustainable, and infinitely renewable. 2 years later, Sarah woke naturally at dawn, her hands already reaching for the prayer wheel that had become as essential as breathing. The small brass artifact caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, its warm glow reflecting the deeper transformation that had quietly revolutionized her daily life. Her latest medical checkup had shown results that Dr. Rodriguez called textbook optimal: inflammation markers in the lowest healthy ranges, perfect vitamin D levels, and a nervous system that showed clear signs of resilience rather than chronic stress activation. But the numbers only told part of the story. "You've become one of those people," Marcus had observed recently, "who makes everyone else feel like they're doing life wrong just by existing peacefully." Sarah had laughed, but privately recognized the truth in his comment. She moved through her days with a quality of presence that felt completely natural to her, but apparently seemed remarkable to others. The prayer wheel had taught her that health wasn't something to achieve, but something to inhabit, moment by moment. Elena stopped by that morning for their monthly tea ritual, bringing her teenage daughter, Maya, who'd started struggling with anxiety around college applications. "Show her the prayer wheel thing," Elena requested. "She's been having panic attacks about her future, and medication makes her feel disconnected from herself." Sarah demonstrated the gentle spinning motion and corresponding breathing pattern, watching Maya's shoulders gradually release tension she probably didn't even realize she'd been carrying. "It's just spinning metal," Maya said skeptically, echoing Marcus from 2 years earlier. "Try it for 5 minutes before bed tonight," Sarah suggested. "Not to fix anything, just to give your nervous system a different signal at the end of each day." Maya agreed reluctantly, but Sarah recognized the same desperation she'd once felt for anything that might provide relief from internal chaos. That afternoon, Sarah's mother called with news that her own doctor had suggested she needed better stress management for her blood pressure. "I've been thinking about those Tibetan practices you mentioned," her mother said. "Could you visit this weekend and show me some of them?" The request felt like a full-circle moment. Sarah had initially worried that her exploration of Tibetan health practices might seem strange or appropriative to family members. Instead, the tangible improvements in her energy and presence had made others curious about accessing similar benefits. She drove to her mother's house that weekend, bringing a second prayer wheel she'd ordered as a gift. They spent Saturday afternoon in the garden, practicing gentle breathing sequences and discussing the Tibetan understanding of health as harmony rather than optimization. "It reminds me of how I felt when you were little," her mother reflected, holding the prayer wheel experimentally. "More patient with myself, less frantic about controlling everything." Sunday evening, Sarah returned to her apartment feeling grateful for the simple practices that had created such profound shifts in multiple generations of her family. The prayer wheel sat quietly on her nightstand, ready for another night of gentle transition between day and rest. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Fell asleep easier last night with the spinning thing. Still think it's weird, but my anxiety felt different, less sharp." Sarah smiled, remembering her own initial skepticism about something so simple creating meaningful change. The Tibetan practices had revealed the poverty of her previous approach to health, always looking for complex solutions to what were often problems of rhythm, environment, and nervous system regulation. As evening approached, she prepared tea using the same deliberate movements she'd learned from watching Tibetan documentaries years earlier. Each gesture had become a form of meditation, not forced mindfulness, but natural presence that emerged from slowing down enough to inhabit each moment fully. The prayer wheel spun quietly in her hands as darkness gathered outside her windows. 2 years of consistent practice had woven these simple rituals into the fabric of her daily life, so seamlessly that she could barely remember the exhausted, anxious person she'd once been. Her grandmother's journal lay open beside her, marked at a passage she'd been contemplating. The mountain people understand something we've forgotten, that healing is not about conquering the body, but about learning to dance with its rhythms. Their practices create space for the body's own wisdom to operate, trusting processes that have sustained human flourishing for millennia. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the brass wheel's familiar weight and motion, gradually synchronizing her breathing and heart rate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but she would meet them from this place of internal stability that no external circumstance could fundamentally disturb. Outside her apartment, the city continued its relentless pace, but she had learned to inhabit a different rhythm, one that honored rest, transitions, and the simple practices that keep a human nervous system regulated in an overstimulated world. The prayer wheel completed another gentle rotation, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of countless moments spent learning to trust her body's intelligence rather than constantly trying to manage it. In this small brass circle, she had found not just better sleep or improved blood work, but a way of being that made everything else in life feel more sustainable. As consciousness gradually faded into rest, Sarah's hands released their gentle grip on the prayer wheel, leaving it spinning slowly in the darkness, a quiet symbol of practices that had taught her the difference between forcing outcomes and creating conditions for well-being to emerge naturally. If this story reminded you that real transformation comes from small habits repeated over time, not from overnight fixes, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to start this journey with you in the next story.